representation is saves lives. I have no qualms going to that extreme. You know, how many times, you know, I have no qualms sharing. I'm a suicide survivor, and a part of me wanting to go down that road was because someone outed me and threatened to tell the school. And I wish I would have had representation through the music that I listened to and the films that I saw, because I wouldn't have built up so many years of just self-deprecating and like self tearing myself down, you know? So like representation saves lives.
So I did want to ask a couple questions about media representation. The first one being, where do you see positive representations of queer and trans people in TV or film?
I recently watched on Netflix, actually, it's called The Half of It, and its lead is a Chinese American person. It's not written by a white guy, and it's not your typical high school romance story arc. So I highly, highly recommend it.
Put Love Victor at the top of the list. It's the first it's a one season show on Hulu that comes post Love, Simon, which is another movie I have on my list. It really it was created to address a lot of the issues that people brought up with Love, Simon, with the fact that the story was centered on a, you know, white, fairly affluent cis boy. So there's some really incredible like Latinx representation in Love, Victor, and it's also just a lot more, it's realistic without being excessively tragic.
The top of my list is Schitt's Creek. I think they did an amazing job in covering queer and trans representation and really approaching it in a way that I have not seen done before. I think it is such like an awkward show, but like, aren't we all just a little awkward at the end of the day? And there's one scene that really sticks out to me that I think stands out for a lot of LGBT folks, which is there's a scene when we assume that one of the characters is queer, and come to find out that they have relations of someone of a different gender than you would assume for them. And they're literally in a wine aisle. And so this person is picking up a bottle of wine, and they look at the other and they were like, so I thought that you liked red wines and only drank red wines. But after last night, it seems that you also like white wines. And he was like, oh, I'm picking up. Okay, yes, I do like red wines and I like white wines. And I've also dabbled in a rosé or two. And so it is just such a beautiful piece of being able to have like that straightforward, of course, yes, using metaphors with wine, conversation around sexuality, but not having it be like this big reveal moment or, oh my God, we need to tell the entire town now, or we need to tell all these people who have just come out. It was just very like nonchalant, literally, as in like, I am choosing this bottle of wine versus this one.
Queer Eye, the reboot. You mentioned intersectionality, and I remember season 5, the first episode that aired was following this man who grew up in the church. And when he came out as an adult, he kind of didn't know where to find his place. And that's so connected with my story. And just seeing that and hearing that you're not alone, because I feel like what our mind tries to tell us and society tries to tell us is that we're alone and that you just need to sit down. No one else is like you, so sit down. But that's the patriarchy at work. And that's so far from the truth.
We have shows like Shira and Steven Universe, who are just really lovely and very gay, and they save the world with the power of gay love and non-binary amazingness.
Sex Education, which is a British show on Netflix that addresses a lot of different queer identities and queer struggles, and has some asexual and pansexual representation. And I think that's a really, really wonderful show.
The other one I'd recommend for youth would be Booksmart. Two studious, like overachiever high schoolers are realizing that they should have had more fun than obsessing over schoolwork. So the day before their graduation, they go wild trying to experience a bunch of firsts. And it's funny, it has queer characters in it, and it's one of the leads is also out about being queer in real life.
I also think of like Sense8 does an amazing job in queer and trans representation. Or this one is actually quite surprising for me. I don't know if y'all watch Big Mouth. This is definitely like older end of the spectrum. So we're thinking of like adolescents who would be watching such a thing. But it is a phenomenal cartoon that really talks about puberty and how awkward of a time that is. And in their newest season, they had their first like trans character. There was already a gay character on the show, and in this new season, they had their first trans character. And I think what I appreciated most about it is the realness of the situation. So not trying to necessarily show how things should be done, but really digging into how situations like, I'll just paint the scene for you. There is a trans character who comes into a summer camp, and essentially this adult counselor is like, hey, here's this new camper, insert name here. They're trans, pushes them into the room. Go ahead, ask all the questions that you want, and then leaves. And that's how it feels so often, is like we are reduced as people to one piece of our identity. And then the support is just, that is what is felt as the support. It's like we are supporting your identity by uplifting it and naming it for this crew, and then we're not going to support you because we're just going to let them ask whatever questions they want, and we don't have the answers, but you do because that's your identity. There is such a history of bad representation or a really problematic representation, and I think Disclosure comes to mind. It's a really great documentary that kind of talks about where we've misled folks in the past around queer and trans identities and how influential media is and being able to uplift folks within community.
The show Pose, FX show Pose by Ryan Murphy. For me, that was the first time where I saw queer brown stories. And that has never been something I have ever experienced as a person of color and as a queer man, simply because most queer stories and queer narratives have always been from the white perspective and the white experience. And, you know, that experience wasn't mine. So I always had to kind of take these stories that I would see in film and just adapt them to my life. But for me, that show was so impactful because it gave me history, queer history that I was not aware of, and also gave me a perspective that was mine. I saw myself in the film. I saw myself as that queer brown kid.
Where do you see positive representations of queer and trans people in books for kids or youth?
So I will say for kids' books, some of the greatest things that I've seen coming out have been through a particular publisher called Flamingo Rampant. It's actually a trans publisher, and pays, you know, authors and artists well for their work and represents a lot of different perspectives and cultures and backgrounds and stories for levels from, you know, kids who are really little, like, you know, 0 to 3 up through kind of puberty and a little bit beyond.
There are a few that come to mind. The first that I absolutely love is Red, a crayon story. Literally talks about a blue crayon that has a red wrapper and just kind of going through the trials and tribulations of figuring out what color crayon they are, because their wrapper is not telling them authentically who they are.
When Aiden became a brother, Julian is a mermaid, they, she, he, as easy as ABC. And there's another they, she, he, me, free to be. Jamie is Jamie, I'm Jay, let's play, one of a kind like me.
Another one that really stands out to me is Julian is a Mermaid. It is more of a picture book, but is truly just one of my favorites to read because of the beautiful graphics in there and drawings, but also because it goes across cultures, and understanding that queer and trans identities are not Western centric. We are folks who have thrived across this world for generations.
Heather Has Two Mommies is one that was recent. It's an older book that was I believe it was kind of republished recently. That's a really lovely one to talk about, LGBT families.
I wrote down just a few books that were helpful to us when our child was in first grade and coming out. And one is I Am Jazz, which is based on Jazz Jennings. Who Are You? The Kid's Guide to Gender Identity, and Meet Polka Dot.
I have a couple that are they're like upper elementary, lower middle school, one is a drama, which is a graphic novel about a young girl questioning her sexuality and coming out. I also have Ivy Aberdeen's Letter to the World and The Misadventures of the Family Fletcher.
I love reading young adult novels because they're like really earnest and tender a lot of the time, and I'm seeing like a lot of development of non-binary and queer and trans characters.
I really liked Tamara Pierce because I think that was the first author that I'd ever found that included trans characters, and it was huge, and had gay characters, and it was like Tamara Pierce started writing back in the 90s, and so during my childhood, and I was like, oh my God, this is like the best thing.
Going back to school is going to be remotely for my child. So I took her to a bookstore and I said, just pick whatever you want. Like, I buy you any book you want. I just want to see you reading something that is different from just being in front of the iPad, right? So anything. And she picked like 4 or 5 books. And I think about 3 of those were young adults, like with a queer LGBTQ theme. Now, I haven't read them. She's reading them right now, but I was happy that they were there.
I have to mention the Percy Jackson series. That was really important to my friend group and I when we were, up and coming queer middle school kids, to have that representation.
Marvel's America Chavez comic, which is also really gay and queer and amazing and like a powerful superhero.
Dreadnought, which is YA, and it is kind of dark and a little bit tragic, but the tragedy is at the beginning, and then the characters get to grow from there, and the main character is a trans girl who accidentally inherits some superhero powers. And so it gets to be like whimsical and playful and empowering, as well as serious and dark.
So Paper Girls, it's mystery science fiction, and it's really good. It takes place in the 80s.
I did just read a book in which there are multiple queer and trans characters, and the book's not about that, which was really cool. They were just characters who happened to be queer and happened to be trans. So that was cool and exciting.
Do you remember what that book was called?
Yeah, it's the Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, which is just a really fun and awesome trilogy of kind of sci-fi futuristic books anyway.
I really appreciate your pointing out how some of these stories have multiple queer or trans characters, because that's one of the mistakes that I see made so often, is a storyline where there's a queer or trans character and that's what their plot line is about. And it's as if they're the only one in the world.
I would love to see someday a show in which the gender identification or the sexual orientation of the people in the show weren't the brunt of the, that wasn't the focus.
I want to see queer witches and queer werewolves. I also want queer characters in really dope storylines that aren't necessarily centered on queerness, but is infused with it.
The hope in the future is that, again, I just want some like mediocre characters who it is just a piece of their plot line that they may be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, but that they are just like every other character dealing with the world that we live in.
Often I'll see shows or movies where the lesbian dies at the end every time.
That is so common.
Or the trans person, it's only a story about their torturous coming out and they're very sad and unhappy, and I don't actually get to see them be just like a happy, joyous person in their life.
So many children's books have this sort of like struggle arc. So there's a kid who identifies as a boy who wants to wear a dress, and they bring their dress into school and they get teased, and then they try again and they get teased again, or they talk to a teacher and the teacher's unsupportive, and then at the end of the story someone helps them find the language to stand up for themselves or to support themselves in some way. And for kids who are old enough to understand the power in that story arc, that means a lot. And for very young kids, they're taking in everything. So what they see is like stepping out of gender norms. It means being bullied, being harassed for a long time, and then maybe a little bit of it'll be good. So when you think about children's books, thinking about the idea of sort of trying to do sort of like I think like an 80-20 or a 60-40 of like positive content, as opposed to messages of struggle, with an ending of acceptance.
To see and have access to just happy media with happy, joyful representation of queer youth and queer identities is so important.
What about other types of media?
I see youth feeling kind of most affirmed and connected with memes on the internet, which is a little bit outside of my scope of experience, but youth seem to really find a lot of affirmation and positive representation in memes.
I actually think like queer and trans youth are doing the best media work on TikTok. I think like they're representing themselves. It's hilarious. It's genius. It's actually genius in the ways that all that content can get into that little snippet in the midst of a stream of content. Because I think the best representation is just people representing themselves, and then coming from a wide array of full selves.
I will say that I am deep into TikTok, which is real cool. I like to think of myself as an anthropologist of youth culture, as I'm like learning that it's now quite cool to be queer in the modern day, which, you know, I think we can unpack more broadly as to where there are contexts where it's okay to be out and queer and celebrated, and others where it may not. But for some reason on the internet now, it is a relatively okay place to be able to come out and be celebrated in one's identity.
So where I'm seeing positive representation now has been in really queer and trans driven and creative media.
Access to publishing is very limited for a lot of folks, particularly queer and trans people, for particularly QT-pop people. And so I watch a lot of slams. I used to go to a lot of slams, but I like, so poetry slams are where I get like my queer and trans youth writing, because I think that's like an accessible form of circulating your work.
You can make up stories for kids.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's not always gonna be there. Because there's, no matter what you do, like publishing is not gonna be caught up with who the children are.
Media representation can't be our end all and be all, but the more power that we put in the hands, frankly, of queer and trans creators, and particularly BIPOC queer and trans creators, the better media that we're gonna just get overall.
I'm a poet, and so I love, I think queer and trans folk write the best poetry. Like, that's super subjective, and I will defend it.
I think there's a lot of great work that's been done, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Because whether we want to accept it or not, queer and trans culture is trying to be erased. And we can't let that happen. And we know that the best forms of resistance is art and television and film. And it's those things that in this culture are being discredited, you know, and being pushed to the side and pushed to the parameters. But it's our responsibility to make sure that we keep representing these communities and representing them well.
Go film your life. Go write a story. Go take pictures of what your day looks like. Go create poetry. Go make art of whatever it is in your community that makes you happy and feel good, or about your identity that makes you happy, or that challenges you, or that makes you sad. Like, we need to see all of that. And the people who are going to be that best are queer and trans creators.